It seems like everywhere you look these days, there's something about the US-Mexico border, like tariffs, troops, even talk about military action. It really feels like things are on the verge of changing, like drastically. And that's kind of the heart of what we're diving into today.
Absolutely. You sent over this YouTube transcript, right, from
Mhm.
Ring of Fire. The title's pretty attention-grabbing. Trump prepares to launch all-out war in Mexico. It definitely presents a particular perspective on everything that's happening.
Yeah, and it really focuses on the whole fentanyl situation, what the cartels are up to, and how the US might react.
Right, exactly. So what we're going to do is sort of break down those main arguments that the transcript makes, try to add a bit of context and figure out, what the big takeaways are, what really jumps out.
So right off the bat, the transcript lays out this idea of Trump proposing a 25% tariff on all goods coming in from Mexico.
Yeah.
But it doesn't frame it as a typical trade dispute.
No, no, not at all. It's presented as very strategic, like a power play.
Exactly. And the goal they lay out is, well, it's pretty blunt. It's to force Mexico's hand, make them crack down harder on the fentanyl coming into the U.S., and ultimately dismantle those cartels.
What's interesting is the comparison the transcript makes to that whole Greenland thing.
Yeah.
You remember a while back there was this idea floating around that the U.S. might try to, like, acquire Greenland.
Yeah, I remember that.
Seems totally unrelated, but the transcript argues there's a similar logic at play, using an unconventional tactic to show just how important something is strategically.
Like with Greenland, it was about securing those rare earth metals and resources,
Yeah.
right?
And here, it's about making serious headway on border security and the whole drug trafficking problems. Basically saying, look, this is a top priority for us, and we're willing to use some pretty big levers to get what we want.
And how does Mexico respond?
Well, the transcript makes it seem like they're almost bewildered. Like, hold on, what exactly are you asking for here? It paints a picture of Mexican officials kind of scrambling to figure out what the U.S. actually wants them to do, because the economic threat, that tariff, is a pretty big deal.
It is.
And then the transcript jumps to this pledge from Mexico, to send 10,000 more troops down to their side of the border. The suggestion being that maybe that tariff threat was what got them to make that commitment.
But here's where it gets a little murky, I guess.
How so?
Because, the transcript points out that Mexico already had something like 13,000 troops along the border. So adding 10,000 more might not be a real increase. Maybe they're just moving people around, maybe even reducing the overall number of troops. It almost feels like a concession that doesn't actually change much on the ground.
I see what you mean. And the transcript definitely plays up this whole elite angle, too, saying these new troops are like special forces less likely to be corrupted by the cartels.
Oh, yeah.
Which kind of cynically implies that maybe the troops who were already there were more susceptible to that kind of influence. It really highlights the issue of corruption, how deeply it runs in Mexico's security forces.
So at that point, the conversation in the transcript shifts to fentanyl, which is, I guess, the core of the whole thing. And it drops some pretty significant numbers.
Way out.
It claims that something like 80 to 90% of the fentanyl coming into the U.S. is actually brought in by, get this, U.S. citizens.
Wow. That's a big disconnect, right?
Huge. All the focus on the border, on Mexico, but the data suggests the main players are actually within the U.S. itself. And then it gets even more interesting. The transcript says most of the fentanyl isn't even crossing the land border. It's coming through ports, legal points of entry.
That really makes you rethink things, doesn't it? If it's U.S. citizens and these official ports is focusing solely on that border with Mexico, really the most effective strategy, it kind of underscores how complicated this is.
Yeah.
It's not just a simple case of drugs flowing across some line in the sand.
Right. And then the transcript mentions something Mexico managed to get out of this whole deal. Apparently, the U.S. agreed to step up efforts to stop those illegal guns flowing south, into Mexico.
Ah, that makes sense.
So the source presents that as a win for Mexico, a recognition that this is a two-way street.
It's a really important point to remember. We often get so focused on what's coming north, but those weapons going south are what fuel the cartel's power. So any progress there is a big deal.
It is. And it really highlights how interconnected it all is, The drug trade finances the cartels and those guns they get. Well, that helps them maintain their power, keep the violence going. Focusing on just one side of the equation isn't going to cut it in the long run.
For sure. Now, the transcript goes on to compare Trump's tactic of using tariffs as leverage, that threat, with Biden's approach. It claims that Biden has actually gotten Mexico to increase their troop deployments 3 times now.
And how did he do that?
By just directly asking. No economic pressure, no threats, just straight up diplomacy. Yeah. It shows there's more than one way to go about things in international relations. Building those relationships, working collaboratively, it can be a powerful tool.
So then things take a bit of a darker turn when the transcript brings up the designation of cartels as terrorist organizations, and it says this has already happened, through an executive order.
Right. And that carries a lot of weight. It potentially lets the U.S. treat cartels differently, legally speaking, opens the door to actions and justifications that are more in line with how they deal with other designated terrorist groups.
And that leads to what the transcript calls a very worrying possibility. It mentions U.S. troops, even generals, being positioned near the border. And then it makes this dramatic claim that the U.S. is, quote, inches away from an all-out war with the cartels. Sounds like things could escalate very quickly.
It definitely does. And it raises a big question about whether the U.S. might actually take military action inside Mexico without, Mexico's okay. The transcript suggests that's something the administration might be seriously thinking about.
And it seems like the Mexican president, at least according to the transcript, kind of sees this coming. But there's a sense of resignation, Like, even if they took out the top cartel leaders, it wouldn't really solve anything. Someone else would just step in and take their place.
It speaks to how entrenched these organizations are. They're not just about a few individuals at the top. They're these complex networks, deeply rooted in society and the economy. Just taking out the head honchos isn't a long-term solution.
So what does the transcript propose as an alternative?
Well, the most straightforward one is just more cooperation. The U.S. and Mexico working directly together, sharing intelligence, supporting each other's efforts to dismantle the cartels from the inside. Sounds pretty logical, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then it throws in these more, let's say, unorthodox ideas. Things like a private army or even bounty hunters being paid to go after cartel members.
Whoa, hold on. Like mercenaries?
Pretty much. It hints that the U.S. might be considering ways to deal with the cartels that are more, indirect, harder to trace back to them.
It sounds like something out of an action movie. A private army operating in another country.
It definitely brings up a lot of ethical and legal questions, and the potential for unintended consequences is huge, making things even more unstable in the region. But the transcript's point seems to be that despite their power, these cartels are vulnerable. They can be taken down if you hit them the right way.
Right. And one more thing I noticed, the transcript specifically gives credit to Sheinbaum Pardo for getting the U.S. to commit to tackling that gun trafficking issue, shows that there are people within Mexico who are actively pushing for progress on these issues.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the economic side of things either. The transcript acknowledges that postponing those tariffs prevented a major economic crisis, at least for now. But it was only a 30-day delay, so there's still a lot of uncertainty hanging over everything. And, economic stability and security, they go hand in hand in this region.
But in the end, the transcript ends on a somewhat hopeful note. It emphasizes the possibility of the U.S. and Mexico finding common ground, reaching solutions they can both agree on. It's a reminder that even with all the tension and the talk of unilateral action, diplomacy is still an option.
What really strikes me after going through this whole transcript is just how complex this situation at the border really is. We've got economic leverage being used as a diplomatic tool, different approaches to security, the stark reality of fentanyl trafficking, the potential for military action, and the constant search for solutions that will actually work.
It's a lot to take in. The different strategies, the surprising facts about who's involved in the fentanyl trade, the very real possibility of a major military operation. It's heavy stuff.
It really shows that there's no easy answer here. To deal with these challenges effectively, you need a strategy that takes everything into account. Not just security, but the economy, both the drugs and the guns, and the political and social realities on both sides of the border.
So thinking about all this, the different approaches, the data on fentanyl, the possibility of, drastic action, what do you think is the best way forward? What's the most sustainable way to address these challenges at the U.S.-Mexico border and with the drug trade in the long term? This deep dive has really just scratched the surface. There's so much more to consider.
That's the point. Hopefully, by exploring these arguments from the YouTube transcript, you've gained a better understanding of just how complex this issue is. We encourage you to keep learning, keep digging into these challenges, and really think about all the different perspectives involved as things continue to unfold.